How's it going, guys? I'm the Stock Retro Gamer, inviting you once again to join me in the murky world of which did it first. Let's do platformers. Platformer games are some of the earliest and most fun games you'll come across. I'll bet a lot of you guys watching were introduced to video games through a platformer of some kind, be it Mario, Sonic, Mega Man, or otherwise. They dominated the gaming industry throughout the 80s and the early 90s with their simplicity and addictiveness. Over the years, they've become bigger, slicker, and more sophisticated. I want to explore the early platformers to see which ones pioneered the core mechanics we know today. Let's take a look. Released in 1980 and developed by CBS Electronics. Space Panic is an arcade platformer game that has you controlling an unnamed protagonist who would dig holes and trap aliens in them. Once you trapped an alien in a hole, you could refill the hole with your shovel to make the alien fall to its death. You would need to kill all the aliens to advance to the next level. The levels incorporated ladder climbing to different platforms to avoid aliens and navigate your guy more effectively, making this the first ever platformer game. Back when released, these weren't even referred to as platformers, but climbing games. The different levels didn't vary much except for more enemies and the ladders changing position, but it was enough to keep you on your toes. Now, there's some debate whether Space Panic can be labelled a true platforming game, given its lack of jumping. It certainly shares other features of platformers, such as its timer and vertically based movements. For me, you control a character that uses platforms to navigate the level, so it counts. But let me know your thoughts in the comments. Quite primitive by today's standards, but with its innovative mechanic, Space Panic laid the groundwork for future platformers. Jumping is the cornerstone of a platformer. Having to expertly time your leap from one platform to another to progress is the core mechanic of the modern platformer, and many different styles and techniques have been explored. Where would you be if you couldn't jump in a platformer? Well, you'd be playing Space Panic, wouldn't you? Pay attention. Released in 1981 and developed by Nintendo. Donkey Kong is a platforming game that has you controlling a guy simply called Jumpman, who must traverse platforms and tackle enemies to save Pauline from the tyrannical ape, Donkey Kong. In order to get to Pauline, you would climb ladders to ascend to platforms, but could also jump over enemies to evade them. Jump over barrels that Kong would hurl at you, and also use jumping to get to other platforms and progress in later levels. Being able to jump in a game now doesn't seem like a big deal, but in 1981 it was pioneering. No other platformer at the time had used jumping as the core mechanic to complete the levels like Donkey Kong, and it really set the standard for future platformers. The Donkey Kong IP would be a very successful one for Nintendo, having several ports, remakes and sequels made on future systems. Not to mention it introduced the world to this little guy, who may get a mention later. It may not have been the first, but Donkey Kong was the game to put platformers on the gaming map. The co-op multiplayer. A chance for you to take on your enemies with a buddy or family member and pass blame when you fail terribly. They enable you to apply a new strategy within the game, that let someone else do the hard work strategy. Usually it meant double the enemies too, but you didn't mind knowing your partner in crime had your back. Released in 1983 and developed by Nintendo. Mario Brothers is an arcade platformer game that has you controlling the titular Mario Brothers, Mario and Luigi. You would traverse a single screen laden with nearly platforms and pipes and would have to clear the screen of enemies by knocking them on their backs and kicking them off. The method you would use to floor your enemies would be hitting the blocks directly below them. A fairly innovative method in itself, and something the series would keep in pretty much every Mario game moving forward. It's also introduced a Koopa Troopa enemy, coin collection, and the power block, which would all feature in future games of the series. Having a second player assisting you in the arena really lent itself to the gameplay, as one of you could incapacitate the enemy, and if positioned right, the other could kick him off screen almost instantaneously for a very smooth and satisfying experience. The Nintendo guys who were responsible for this were Shigeru Miyamoto and Gunpei Yokoi. Both heavy hitters, with Gunpei designing the Game Boy and the D-pad, and Shigeru, I'm sure he went on to do something. In all seriousness, these guys were very much the John Lennon and Paul McCartney of Nintendo with what they achieved. Honourable shout out to Koji Kondo too. Mario Bros. Was originally a spin-off of Donkey Kong and was the first appearance of Mario's younger brother, Luigi. A fairly simple game, but with the co-op multiplayer inclusion very fun and addictive. A precursor to the game that changed everything in the world of platformers.
You know of what I speak, Gandalf.
Jumping on your enemies' heads in platformers is one of the simplest and most effective methods to dispatch of them. Developers needed a way of not just avoiding the bad guys, but disposing of them completely, and the head stomp is a great way of doing this without losing any momentum. Released in 1985 and developed by Nintendo, Super Mario Bros. Is a side-scrolling platformer that has you playing as the titular plumber, Mario, who must make his way through 8 worlds to rescue his Princess Peach from the evil King Bowser. You would scroll from left to right in the Mushroom Kingdom to get to the end flagpole, which signalled the end of the level. In your way would be a myriad of enemies to get through. How would you do that? By jumping on their heads, of course. Super Mario Bros. Introduced a head stomp mechanic as a quick way to kill your enemies. This simple method tested a player's aim and was just fun to pull off. This mechanic was soon being used in platforming games that followed, given its simplicity, and to this day is the go-to method to clean house. Now, it would be criminal of me to only credit Super Mario Bros. With the mere head stomp, as important as that was. Super Mario Bros. Really was the platformer that made them a thing. How it looked and played were head and shoulders above the competition at the time, with its bright colours and sharp graphics, coupled with a tight gameplay and realistic physics such as skidding, sliding, and gaining momentum. It didn't pioneer these things, but it certainly polished them to a shine, making the game a global phenomenon, and very much making Mario a household name. Let's not forget the timing of this, as we just had the video game crash of 1983, so when Mario came out 2 years later, released with the NES, it was very much seen as the saviour of the industry, and really does deserve that title. Early video games would use the flip screen method when they wanted the player to advance to another location. This would mean once the player reached the edge of the screen, the game would automatically load up the next screen for you to navigate. Soon enough, developers found a way of having all the action on one continuing scrolling screen, giving the player a seamless experience with side-scrolling. Released in 1981 and developed by Alpha Denchi, Jumpbug is a platforming horizontal shooter game that has you controlling a Volkswagen Beetle, shooting your way through monsters in a city, mountains, and underwater. You would jump in your Beetle onto buildings, shooting aliens and collecting money bags to progress. Jumpbug was the first platform game to use the side-scrolling technique, meaning the levels were one continuous and seamless experience. The method was called full scrolling, where the screen scrolls horizontally, regardless of whether the player was moving or not. Some segments of the game would have the screen scrolling vertically to keep the gameplay fresh and challenging. In these parts, the screen would only scroll once you've progressed further, which meant the player had more control and could relax. Jumpbug was also the first video game to feature parallax scrolling, albeit in a very limited capacity, with the starry night and the clouds moving independent to the foreground. Parallax scrolling would be a mainstay of platforming games moving forward, being perfected in such games such as Moon Patrol and Jungle Hunt. Side-scrolling was refined in future platformers, giving total control to the player in regard to where they take the screen, and was the go-to technique for level exploration. Speed can be a very useful thing in platformers. Being able to accelerate and slow down transforms the gameplay mechanics, allowing for greater player control and engagement. It would mean developers could design more complex and varied levels that demanded quick reflexes and strategic thinking. It also birthed a gaming hobby called speedrunning. Released in 1984 and developed by Namco, PacLand is an arcade platformer game where you play as PacMan, making your way through 5 levels, or trips as they're called in the game. Your goal is to return the lost fairy to Fairyland. Innocent times. The game is based on the PacMan cartoon, which was in turn based on the original maze action game, PacMan. So it's a video game based on a cartoon, based on a video game. Stay with me. You would move from left to right, jumping over obstacles and trying to avoid enemies, including the 4 infamous ghosts from the original PacMan game. Just like in PacMan, you could eat pellets that made the ghosts vulnerable to your attack, and it was just as satisfying to give chase. The controls for the game were a bit out there. Instead of pressing a direction to move, you would merely hold a button. Double tap that button and hold, and you'd be able to speed up your movement, making PacMan the first platformer to use the accelerate mechanic. Being able to accelerate your speed meant you could jump further and avoid enemies with ease. It was also just fun to be able to whiz through the levels at high speed. PacMan is also notable for having side-scrolling that moved with the player and allowed for backtracking, realistic physics like skidding, a colourful cartoon-like art style. It's fair to say the accelerate mechanic caught on with later platformers, and pretty soon many will let you tackle them at your desired pace. Nonlinear Games force the player to explore and take risks to progress in the adventure. They test the player's memory and fortitude with their labyrinth-like levels. Made popular with games such as Legend of Zelda, Metroid and Castlevania, this genre would eventually adopt the term Metroidvania, and it naturally meshed with the platformer genre. Released in 1984 and developed by Activision, Pitfall 2 Lost Caverns is a platformer game released on the Atari 2600 that has you controlling Pitfall Harry. The sequel to the much revered Pitfall, Pitfall 2 decided to expand on the game, giving the player much more freedom to explore than just running from left to right. Now Harry could explore tunnels and large areas under the main plane, using ladders and balloons to move vertically within the arena. The aim of the game was to find Quickclaw the cat, Harry's niece Rona, and recover the Raj Diamond. Having clear set out goals in the game, rather than just lasting until your timer was up, was a welcome addition to the series, and gave something for the player to aim towards. Pitfall 2 is the first example of a non-linear platform game, as the player could progress in the game in any direction they pleased, forcing them to explore the world and risk getting lost. As you progressed, you would run over red crosses that acted as checkpoints, which was the first time this was used in a video game too. New gameplay mechanics such as swimming and balloon riding were included to make exploring the multi-level terrain easier. The game really pushed the limits of the Atari 2600 with the size and the graphics. The devs realised that this game was too much for the Atari, and so created a custom computer chip for it to run, called the Display Processor Chip. This chip upgrade allowed for improved graphics and background music. The game was well received on release, and was the first taste of how deep and layered platformers can be, and it makes the list. In the mid-90s, 3D games were more commonplace and impressive, and of course platformers wanted a piece of that action. They introduced dynamic camera controls and intricate level design, and pretty soon nearly all platformer franchises were getting the 3D treatment. Released in 1990 and developed by Infogrames, Alpha Waves is a 3D maze platformer initially released on the Atari ST, but then ported to the Amiga and MS-DOS. You would control one of 6 crafts that were geometric shapes and jump to and from trampoline-like platforms. The game had 2 modes: Action Mode, which required you to enter new rooms before your timer ran out, and Emotion Mode, which let you explore the 3D space at your leisure with no particular goal but enjoy it. Alpha Waves took place in a fully 3D arena and used flat-shaded 3D objects, making it the first 3D platformer game. The game was all about the chilled vibes, especially when playing in Emotion Mode. Its simplicity and music made it feel more like a feast for the senses than a video game. It kind of reminds me of that Star Trek TNG episode, the one where all the crew are hooked on that VR game, Anyone? Fine. Now, 3D games had existed prior to Alpha Waves, but it did bring a number of innovations to the 3D gaming experience, such as depth of field, which is being able to see objects disappearing in the distance. Quite a large number of 3D objects displayed simultaneously. Same split-screen multiplayer on the Atari and Amiga versions. Alpha Waves really showed what platformers could do within the 3D arena. 3D platformers didn't catch on straight away, since 2D platform games still ruled the roost for another 5 years or so. But eventually developers mastered 3D video game mechanics, and there was no going back. So that was platformers Which Did It First. I hope you enjoyed the video, guys. I have a few more of these Which Did It First genres I'd like to cover. Be sure to give a like and subscribe if you want to see more of these, as it really does help the channel. I'm the Stock Retro Gamer, and I'll catch you in the next one.